Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Tracy Chow with us. Tracy, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, Tracy, you've been a software engineer at Pinterest for over 2 years, which basically means you've had front row seats to kind of watch the rocket take off, right?
Yeah, it's been a pretty fun ride.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it has. And we're going to get into kind of what that ride has been all about. But first, tell us a little about Pinterest. And I know that by this point, most people have used it. But in your own words, what's the vision of Pinterest today? What are you guys trying to accomplish?
Right, so our vision is really to help people live inspired lives. We want to help people discover things that they love and then help them go out into the real world and do those things. So for my personal use case, I really like reading, I really like running, I like travel, and Pinterest is really great for me to collect inspiration and then actually go act on that. So for running, like I might look at running routes on Pinterest and then try to go out and do them. For travel, it might be collecting places I want to go to. So these are the sorts of things that we want to help people like find what inspires them and then enable them to go do those things.
Yeah. Already I love your answer because you're focusing on the benefits, not the features. And that's one thing that so many companies mess up on. You didn't say, oh, we let you pin stuff and it's kind of this wall of things and you can scroll through it all. That's a boring answer, and it's the wrong answer. Yeah, you do all those things, but it's the inspirational stuff. It's the what are we going to do in our life because of it. And so already you're an engineer, but you're speaking like someone who has a great sense of like brand and what that means. So I just want to tell other people, listen to her answer, because even though she knows a lot about engineering, it wasn't an engineering answer, and it was the right answer. Now, over the past few years, you guys have grown to 50 million plus active users. What do you think is most responsible for that kind of meteoric growth when you look out from the inside?
I mean, there's a lot of things. Some of it is just that we have built a product that we think resonates with a lot of users and is really valuable to a lot of people. There's a lot of hard work and executing on the vision. It's really important that all the technical pieces are there, but those are kind of just like the fundamentals, and then a lot of it's just like iterating on the product and trying to understand what's useful to people, whether it's getting partnerships so that there's like big brands that are pinning content that's really valuable to our pinners, or if it's building more useful features like making rich pins more actionable. So we have like recipe pins where you can do, you can look at the metadata, like the ingredients that you need, cooking instructions. Like these are things that make them more useful. We can work on discovery to connect people to content. There's a lot of different things in the product. So I guess the answer is really it's a lot of hard work and trying to make something that people find valuable.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you mentioned kind of two categories of things there. There's the creating something that people love, and there's also the technical behind-the-scenes scaling to make sure you can deliver that thing that they love. Which comes first? Should you worry about the technical stuff until somebody loves it, or should you worry about the technical stuff from day one? What do you think?
You should worry about the product first. It doesn't really matter if you have great code quality and a great architecture for your systems if nobody is using your product. For us at Pinterest, we started off with a really basic Django app that was just not very intelligent at all. Pretty hacky, but it was enough to get us to a point where we could validate the hypotheses around the product. Like, will people find this valuable? Will they engage with this sort of an interface and use it the way like we think would be valuable? And over time, we've been working on improving all the technical stuff. So one of the first projects I worked on here was a big code-based refactor. Okay, we need to start onboarding more engineers, and we need to build out the technical side to support a larger engineering team. So some of that is decoupling different concerns of different services, defining better abstractions and interfaces. And at that point, when you have a product that people are starting to use and you need to scale, it's worth investing a lot more in the engineering side. You don't want your service to be going down all the time, and you don't want bugs to be introduced anytime a new engineer joins. But it is very important that you have something that people care about using in the very beginning.
Well, let me ask you about that, because you mentioned it's important that it doesn't go down all the time. And I think about another company that just went public, and their service went down all the time when they were kind of on the way figuring out, how to scale. Pinterest doesn't seem to have those same problems. What did you guys do differently? What did you all do that Twitter didn't? Because you guys are actually using a lot more rich media, a lot more photos. They were using text, and they couldn't keep it up. So what were you guys doing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. Like early on, we did go down a reasonable amount.
Uh-huh.
But getting the right general systems architecture in place is super important. Um, if you think of the analogy of building a big like house or an apartment building, you want to get the supports in there and you want to design like the overall structure to be right. If you're building with sticks and like duct taping things together, then things keep falling over no matter what it is that you're trying to serve. So I think in terms of the type of content that we're serving, it's not really so significant, but making sure that we had the basic structure in place. Like we had to split out our database system into a different service pretty early on, just to be able to support that scale of like QPS, and that was pretty critical for us. That we're serving a lot of data, so anytime you look at a feed page, there's a lot of pins on there. We have to fetch a lot of data from the databases, or put caching in front of that to make sure that's efficient.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of stuff had to be split out into a very solid service early on. Another good thing about separating that out into its own service is that you don't have a lot of people accidentally screwing it up. So if it's isolated into its own thing, you define the interfaces very well, and you can support those use cases pretty well. That was one of the first big architectural things we did, was to move our databases into this like sharded MySQL service. And then as time has gone on, we've been splitting out things into different services, and so those have different definitions around like what kind of uptime they need, or how we deal with failures. So for some different services, like if they stop returning data, then we just don't show the data. Those are more critical, so we have like very severe paging on those. Like if there's any sort of blips in latency or sort of like availability issues, we can start responding to those very quickly. But a lot of it is just making sure that your overall system is well designed.
Yeah, it almost seems like a catch-22 hearing you talk about it, because at first you have to create something people love, so you're not supposed to spend all this time on the infrastructure. So in a sense, you're using duct tape, you're using sticks, but then as it grows, that's not going to work. So you have to kind of rethink the foundation at some point. Is that accurate? That you have to start with what you have, but you will have to rebuild the foundation if it works?
Right. Yeah. I think that's actually probably the most viable strategy for a lot of startups, is to build something that is kind of duct taped together and then port it over to something more robust and scalable.
How many times have you guys had to go back to the foundation? Is that just like once, or is it every 6 months you're going back to the foundation and rethinking things?
We don't do it that often. I feel like it was around the time that I joined about 2 years ago when we did a really big migration. But over time, since we got a basic system in place, it's been easier to swap out smaller components. So it hasn't been as much of a big architectural overhaul as we had to do that one time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, but half of Pinterest is made up of engineers. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
So how many people is that? What's the head count right now?
The total company is a little bit over 200, so engineering is a little bit over 100.
So help me understand what 100 engineers are doing on Pinterest, because I look at Pinterest and I can see a way for there to be a lot of engineers on it, but 100 engineers, what are they doing there?
100 is not even close to enough. It's nowhere close to enough. So there's so many things that we're working on. In terms of like the back end scaling, what people always think about in terms of scaling is infrastructure and ops. So our infrastructure team is making sure that everything is running smoothly, that we're able to support all the different data queries that we need to use for the site. Ops is making sure that our servers are running well, we have good systems for deploying, keeping things up, and monitoring alerts. So there's a lot on that. You'll run into a lot of issues as you scale. You just run into new bottlenecks. So just to give you like one example, for a while we had our database systems, we had some caches, and then we had some web servers and API servers. And to relieve the load on the database, we have all of the caching in place, like Memcache, and all of the app and API servers would just directly talk to the Memcache servers. So that was pretty good for a while, and we needed to support more traffic. We just add more web servers and API servers, and at some point, we maxed out on the number of connections that the Memcache servers could give out. So we could no longer add more web and API servers because they couldn't talk to the cache servers anymore. So that's a problem when you have, say, like these app and API servers and N cache servers. You have M times N connections, and that's greater than the number that Memcache supports.
Exponential at that point.
So then we had to figure out what's a more scalable strategy. So putting a reverse proxy in the middle, where P number of like servers in the middle. So you have your M app and API servers are talking to P of these, like where we're using Nutcracker servers in the middle, and those P Nutcracker servers talk to the N servers. So you have to sometimes like redo a bunch of this stuff, just these like fundamental constraints.
Yeah. So
and some things like in terms of serving more traffic, we're using Python, which is not great for multi-threading. There's a global interpreter lock in most implementations of Python. So to figure out how to get around that, like how do we improve the performance while not disrupting the developers too much? Like we could just say we're going to switch to a different language like Java, which is going to be a lot better for concurrency. But that means that it's pretty disruptive to all the engineers. We have to rewrite everything.
That's huge.
It's pretty big. So how do we get better gains in terms of a concurrency while not completely disrupting the developer flow? So we started adding a G event, which is a more, it's kind of like threading, so it's cooperative instead of preemptive. So there's a lot of places we had to go in and patch the code to make sure that it would work that way. And we had to, for example, rewrite our memcache client because before it had C bindings and you can't monkey patch using C. So we had to write a pure Python memcache client. So there's some things we had to do there, but it's just like the different challenges you run up against as you try and make sure your costs aren't too high.
Okay, you've convinced me. I can see why you need 100 engineers now. You've thrown out enough keywords and enough jargon. I'm convinced.
That's only like one part of it. So that's like the infrastructure and ops side of it. We also have the platform team, so like web, Android, iOS. So we have to build the interfaces that the users are seeing. And so there's pretty high surface area in terms of the product that we're exposing to users. Figure out like what are some good discovery points, like how do we make each of these pins more useful. We recently launched place pins and place boards, so you have like a new map overlay for your boards. Like there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen on the client. We have like a large need for like data analysis and data infrastructure to make sure we understand what's going on. So when you're a smaller product, you can just kind of use your intuition. You don't have enough data to do any sort of interesting data analysis anyways. But when you get scale, your intuition may not be very accurate anymore. If you're serving a population that's very different than yourself, or just like at scale, things happen that you don't necessarily understand. So we need good data to understand, like when we launch new features, what is the effect on our user base. There's interesting analysis on things like when we have people who use the mobile apps versus the website, how does their usage vary? So you might think that if you use the website and then use mobile apps, like your time on them is just like the average of the web users' time, the average of mobile users' time. But what it turns out is that when people use both the web and mobile apps, their time on Pinterest increases. So there's a synergistic effect. And so we have a lot of hypotheses around that. Maybe it's just that becomes such an important part of your life that you start using the service more because it's more available in all different scenarios. You use the service more. But we wouldn't have known that without doing the data. And it's really important for us then to see like, okay, so if you use the mobile apps, it actually increases your usage of the website as well. Like then we should be pushing people to do that more. So it's a direction in addition to just our usual like intuition.
Yeah.
So these are just like a sampling of some of the different engineering things we need to work on, but there's a lot more going on as well.
No, it sounds like it. All right, if you were to have 20 more engineers today, what's the hard problem you would put them on that everybody at Pinterest knows you have to deal with, but it hasn't been dealt with yet?
That's a really great question. So I think right now we're actually really constrained on all the different clients. So we don't have enough web and mobile engineers. So we actually have a lot of really great work happening in the back end, like improving our feed services, improving search and discovery. And we've been working with a lot of like rich pins to get pins to be more actionable and useful and getting data from partners, but we don't have enough resources to build out these things in the client and build out these different experiences. So I wouldn't say necessarily it's like a really hard problem that we just need people to like think really hard about. So we have a lot of stuff that we need to build that we don't have enough people on right now. Yeah,
absolutely. Now, what's the engineering culture like there? Because you've worked at some high-profile places. You've been at Quora, you've been around Facebook. How is the culture different? How is it better? How is it not as good? Tell me about the culture a little bit.
Yeah, so one thing I would say about Pinterest is that we value pinners a lot. So we talk about being a pinner-led culture. Some companies like Google are very clearly engineering-driven cultures. Facebook is kind of engineering and product-driven. Quora was very engineering and design-driven. I feel like at Pinterest, it's not so much driven by one of these teams as it is very collaborative. So we talk about knitting as one of our values, where we say like the best things happen when a lot of different disciplines knit well together. And there's a really big focus on collaboration, understanding all the different aspects. So when we are launching new products or thinking about new products, we loop in not just engineering, but the product side, product management, design, community, data. And so we have a lot more voices represented. And I think it's really awesome that we do that because it makes sure that the things that we're building as engineers are useful. They'll improve the user experience. And as an engineer, I trust that something I'm going to be building will be well designed. And that's a little bit different than some of the other places I've seen. In terms of like the collaborative element, I feel like I learn a lot more about a lot of different things. So when we're thinking about new features, I'm thinking a lot more from the aspect of from the perspective of what does the community team see? Like if they're responding to pinners and seeing the sort of tickets that are coming in, so like the points of confusion, like when I can work closely with the community team, I start to understand that user perspective a lot better. And it actually helps me to be a better engineer as well, because I think about what are all the potential use cases, so what are the right abstractions to design. That when we need to build out more features, like I might just be building one thing right now, but if I'm going to be extending it and scaling it out to more use cases, like what is the right type of abstraction to build? So I think it makes me a better engineer to have all these different perspectives like fed in. But yeah, it is different. Like some people prefer to be in an engineering-driven culture. If you're an engineer and you like want to call the shots, like some places may be better for you.
As I've heard you talk about kind of the culture, the people, the technology, it seems like a theme is kind of emerging, which is when you first start, everybody does everything because you just have to. That's the duct tape stage. Everyone's just in there. You're a part of probably analytics and the feed and the emails and everything else. But then as things grow, with the technology, you have to silo off things. So now we need a database just for this. We need a database just for that. We need processes just for this. And then also with the people, you have to silo them off. We need a group just for community. We need a group just for infrastructure. And then the goal is, how do you let the technology speak to each other and the people speak to each other in really beneficial ways? Is that seem like what you're describing? Is that accurate?
So there's organizational challenges in scaling when you can't just have everybody talking to everybody else anymore. You start to need better structures around who is the point of contact, who is the owner for some project or a feature or some piece of infrastructure. So yeah, it is very important that we start defining these roles more clearly. When you're really small, there's like one person on community and like they talk to everybody else, like one engineer on email and like they figure out everything that needs to happen there. Now we need to have a better process around that. So we have regular meetings for various functions to sync up. So we have bi-weekly meetings with the leadership team. Like all the different teams are going to talk to them and talk about what products they're working on, like the progress in the last 2 weeks, what needs to happen in the next 2 weeks, what sort of blockers there are or other dependencies. So we make sure that we're in sync with people, like at that level. The product managers will sync up regularly across engineering. It depends on like what sort of things you're working on, but there are regular sync points to make sure that we're all working well together.
It's almost like you have to engineer the culture. You talk about dependencies, you talk about syncing with each other. It's almost like there has to be some kind of language that you guys are coding in to make sure all the human pieces work together in the right way at the right time, doing the right thing.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's been a really fun challenge to look at how we've scaled the company as well as scaling the product. Just like from the engineering side, like how do we structure our code so that a lot of people can work on it? One of the best ways to do that was starting to split out things in different services and then moving those services into their own Git repos. So you're not stepping all over each other's toes when you're working on your code. We can do deploys separately for the different services. So it's been really good from the engineering side, like different engineers or different teams are owning different pieces of our infrastructure or different pieces of the product. So you know who to go to, who's responsible for something. But across the company as well, it's been important to figure out like what are the areas of ownership and who are the people that you need to talk to for various things. And there's a lot of things that require just very creative thinking about how to scale. So an example of something I worked on recently was our bugs program. So bugs are really interesting thing. So many bugs all the time, anytime you're writing software. So there's also bugs that come from like code issues, the bugs that come from data, the bugs that come from like servers going down. So bugs are pretty challenging to work with because it's very easy to not roadmap them or not put them into your planning. And the way bugs can get surfaced, like they can be tickets filed by pinners or just community members. And so the people who work on the community team see those tickets and figure, oh, there is like an issue that we need to address. But then how do you route those to the right engineers to fix and understand the severity? So we've had to come up with a process for that. The way you do it when you're really small is that you have like one person who's kind of responsible for routing all the bugs, and they just keep all the information in their head about what they need to do for different types of bugs. If it's an engineer, they can help like dive into it and diagnose like where the issue is and then send it to the right engineer. That doesn't scale very well when you have like 100+ engineers, and there's a lot of bugs that come from interactions of code where the assumptions are different from the caller and the callee's perspectives. Like just like at the service boundaries, like if you have different assumptions, you'll end up with bugs, or there's just like straight up bugs as well. So it's a little bit trickier to figure out who to route bugs to. And something that shows up on the website could be something, it could be due to an issue happening at the database level, or it could be something at the caching level, or maybe at the application logic level, or maybe it's in the API level, or maybe it's in the web app level. Like it's like bugs could be. So to figure out where to assign those things can be tricky. So what we've been trying out here is building out something of a decision tree and a map of who works on what. And there's some like useful tricks that you can try. So like our website is built on top of the API. So if you see a bug in the web, one thing we'll tell people to do is like try to reproduce it in the mobile apps. And so if the bug can reproduce in web and mobile, that means that the bug must exist at least at the API level or below. So it's different questions like that you can ask to help figure out the routing of like where these issues should go, and then figuring out like what is the best way to represent like what different people are working on, so we know how to route things to them. So like, if it has to do with our offsite service, which is like when people are clicking off of Pinterest, we have to run a bunch of checks to make sure that content is safe. So our Black Ops team is responsible for that, but there's one person in particular that's responsible for that service. So we can say like, okay, if you run into an issue with this thing, it goes to this particular engineer. And in building out this sort of like routing process, we've reduced the mean time to resolution of bugs because we've gotten bugs to the right engineers much faster. And a lot of times when you see bugs, we report by community, there are new issues that come up by recent code changes. And so if you can get an engineer that introduced the bug just like a day ago, it's familiar to them, it's very easy for them to fix that. It's trickier if you route to the wrong person, they don't have the context for those changes, and then they bounce it back to somebody, like, maybe later or somebody else. So getting a bug to the right person immediately helps reduce that mean time to resolution quite a bit. So it's a process that we've had to build out, and it's something that we're still iterating on. Like right now, it might make sense to have like all the bugs that can't be routed through the system go to one default engineer. But at some point that needs to be more scalable. So like, do you have like a rotating point of contact, or is there some other way to file tickets? So there's a lot of interesting like scaling challenges within organizations. So it's like a blend of the technical and human elements.
Yeah.
One of the things that we have to work on.
Yeah, no, it's great to kind of see the inside of Pinterest, because most of us don't work on companies that are that large, don't have the same kinds of issues. But like I said before, if we're lucky, these are the kinds of things we're going to have to think about. And it just gives us a really good kind of working model of someone who's many steps ahead of us, so we can see the road ahead. So it's just great getting inside of Pinterest there. Now, you've been the tech lead on a few different projects at Pinterest, and one of the things that you led was the big redesign that you guys recently launched. Rewrote the code, redesigned, rethought things. What was the driving force behind that decision to kind of redo the website in some ways?
Right. So one slight correction, I wasn't a lead on that project. I actually switched to the web team as we started working on that. But I can talk a little bit about the reasons why we decided to do that. So on the engineering side, the first was that we just had so much technical debt that it was very difficult to develop code and to be confident that things we were building would work the way we expected, and the things that we didn't want to affect weren't affected. So that was one thing where we just had a bunch of spaghetti code that, it was like duct tape. It got thrown together early on. Another big consideration was that, Pinterest was started a few years ago when mobile apps were not nearly that big yet, so everybody was kind of like this web first mentality. So we built our website first, and then later, as iPhone came out and like those apps became more popular, we built an API to support our iPhone app. But we had a branching of the code between the web and the API, and API traffic has far surpassed web traffic by this point. But for a long time before this Reader project, we had this like splintering of the code where web was actually by default prioritized for development in a lot of ways because a lot more people are familiar with web development, so it's easier to go in and like hack something up, and the web would just go. It had privileged access to a lot of our data, just kind of reach in and grab stuff that it needed, whereas the mobile clients were gated on the API. So because like these were split, there were some things where the web could get access sooner. The API clients were blocked on API development. There are sometimes inconsistencies between the two, where we might just do like filtering differently on search results, for example, between the two, and then you get different results on the different platforms. So that was something we wanted to address, and we didn't want this like fracturing of our engineering attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so the last thing was that the way we had built the website originally, we didn't have a real client-side architecture, so we couldn't really be a full-featured web app. If you think of a web app as something like Gmail, where you'll sit on gmail.com and click around, but you never really leave gmail.com.
Mm-hmm.
That is an app, whereas like something where you're clicking between pages and doing full loads, like say you're on the New York Times and you click to like another page, it doesn't really feel like a web app. You're just like loading different pages. We want to be more of a web app where we can maintain your state. Say you're scrolling down a feed and you click into explore something and you're jumping all the way in, and then you want to back out. We want to maintain your state in all those different views that you were in. We want to be able to cache different modules that you've already loaded so we can be more performant. So there's a lot we wanted to do on the client, but we just didn't have like the architecture at all there originally. So these are the three major reasons that we had for like the rewrite on the code side. But at the same time, from the design side, we knew we wanted to do a design refresh of the entire site, and so we ended up bundling the two together to do a code rewrite while also redoing all the design.
Yeah. Was it? Do you feel like you bit off too much, or was that the right way to go about it, doing design and kind of code? Do you think it worked out that you did them both at the same time?
So yeah, it worked out. There's definitely pros and cons of doing everything at once. So one big danger is that if you bite off too much, you may not be able to get any of it done. Right? So there's more moving pieces, more points of failure, more reasons why you might just completely fail. Luckily, we did not. We actually managed to rewrite everything in a reasonable time frame.
How long did it take? I'm curious.
It took about 8 months to get to a full rollout, although we were showing, we had code in production, was serving pinners like 3 months in.
Okay, was that to see what the bugs are or to see how they're interacting with the design? Was that kind of customer development at that point?
Yeah, some of that. Some of it was just like making sure that it would work at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like test it. Does this even like support this many requests? Like, can we show this to users at all? It's also very gratifying for engineers and people who are working on stuff to start seeing things in production sooner, because you feel like you're making actual progress and you make sure you're not going off like in the deep end and never going to come back. So if you start putting stuff in front of people sooner, you can iterate, you can figure out what the big issues might be. And, so we were pretty happy with the way everything turned out. There definitely were some challenges in redoing the code and design at the same time where we couldn't isolate some of the effects. So, if we saw that some numbers dipped, we didn't know why.
You didn't have a control group.
Yeah, when you want to do like an experiment, you usually just want to change one thing at the time, so you know that the changes that you see are due to that one thing. So we had a number of cases where we didn't know if a dip in the metrics might be due to code changes. Like maybe our performance was worse, like maybe we had increased latency, so that would be a problem, or there might have been bugs, or maybe it's that the design changed. So like one example of this that we saw that board follow numbers went down as we were testing out the new version. So we didn't know if it was because the board follow button was now in a different place and it was now gray instead of red, or if it was something else. And it turns out we did a bunch of data analysis and figured out that what was driving board follows on the classic experience was a few different modules, or one of the modules that we just hadn't prioritized implementing in the new site yet. So we took a modular approach to re-implementing everything. So there's some things that we prioritized like implementing first. And one of them was this on success, when you're pinning, we show you a different board that you might be interested in following that's related to what you just pinned. And that was something that we hadn't prioritized building the new site because we didn't think it was that important. It was driving a lot of the numbers. So it wasn't a design issue. We had run this design experiment and said, like, oh, maybe we could change the color of the follow button back to red. Maybe it'll help. Maybe there's like some other things. Like maybe we need to reposition it. It turns out we just needed to re-implement that module that we were going to implement at some point. We just like hadn't gotten around to it yet, and that accounted for the difference.
Yeah.
So it made it a little bit harder to understand like why changes in metrics were happening. But overall, it got us to the completed state with like a new code base and new design much faster than if we had done them serially. So we knew that we were going to have to rewrite everything. We were going to have to redo all the styling and the front end stuff when we switched to a new design. So we didn't want to rebuild the old design on the new framework and then have to rebuild everything again. It probably would have been really demotivating as well for people to like build something they knew that they would immediately have to scrap. So in terms of like the end outcome, it made a lot of sense for us to do the thing, like both of those together. And we got to a pretty good place with our code and there's like fresh new design. It was good also that we were changing the design in some ways because to other people who were not working on the project, like they could see the visible progress like here.
Yeah, which feels good.
It feels good, and it's super important that like the team that's working on the team that's observing from externally like are all bought into the project to like adequately resourced and there's like general support for it within the company.
Yeah.
So in the end, it worked out really well.
Yeah. Did you guys use the same programming language when you did the rewrite, or did you have to really?
Yeah, so it was the same programming languages, which was really key as well. So it was like Python, JavaScript, Jinja for the templating, and Sass for the CSS. I think that was also really key in the success of the project that we had experience working with those languages. I've been on another rewrite project in the past at a different company where we were writing to a new language, and it was pretty tricky because nobody knew the target language that we were porting over to. So that introduced just like a whole other level of difficulty. Like I know how to do this thing in Python, but I don't know how to do it in Scala. Like,
what's the reasoning why people want to write in a new language? Is it because there's some new trendy language and we feel like we need to do it? Is that the reason why your last company wanted to change languages?
There's some reasons why people will say like for languages that are like Java or Scala that are compiled, statically typed, better concurrency. Like there's performance reasons for doing that. There may be a little bit of the trendiness, but I think usually it is driven by the technical considerations. Like Scala is more functional, so in theory it's like a lot better for concurrency, and you can reason about the code better. It's not too verbose. And so it should be still like pretty easy for developers to write in. Like a lot of complaints people have about Java is that you have to write a lot of boilerplate all the time, and it's not very fun to do that. But with Scala, like there's a lot of smart type inference. You get to write code that is not too verbose, like more similar to like Python or something like that. But you also still get a lot of the benefits of being on the JVM and having it be compiled and statically typed, so you make sure that like you don't do really silly things. Passing arguments incorrectly or whatever. But in this case at Pinterest, like because we were writing to the same languages that we were already very familiar with, it made things a lot easier. We were already familiar with the languages and like what they were capable of, so it also gave us better intuition of what was possible and what we could do.
I've been involved in complete rewrites as well, and I breathed a sigh of relief when it was over. Yeah. It's a scary process, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool when you like get to the finish. You're like, wow, like this completely clean code base, like very modular. It's like exactly what we would want. Like a lot of times you'll get into a code base and you're like, if I could do this over from the beginning, like it would be different knowing like what we know now about the use cases and such. But it's very hard to get those opportunities to actually, rewrite stuff to the way that you would want to.
Yeah. And now one of the other things that you worked on at Pinterest was the feed quality. Is the feed quality just the quality of the pins you're being shown as you scroll around the site?
Yeah, so there's the project that we were working on was specifically about the public feed. So if you're looking at categories like art or history or gardening, travel, we want to make sure that we're showing you good content there that's thematically correct. For a while, we were just using what Pinterest had labeled as the correct categories. But the way that worked was a little bit brittle. So if you create a board on Pinterest, you can choose the category that it belongs to. So we're just like this like limited set of like 30 some categories, and you can pin to it. And we would just say, okay, based on the category that you labeled your board as, like we would put pins from those into the public feeds, those categories. But there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't work. Like sometimes people don't really care about labeling their boards correctly, or sometimes the boards don't belong in one of those categories. Like if you have something that's just like both travel and outdoor stuff.
Mm-hmm. So how do you get around that? Because it seems like a hard logic problem there.
Right. So what we did originally was like it was very simple, like based on the product. Like there's no interesting like data work being done there. So we started shifting over to a more robust model where we could use machine learning input, so we could start training on the data to figure out like what is this pin actually likely to be.
What are you looking at? I mean, what in the data are you looking at to decide what it might be?
So there's a lot of signals we have actually. So for pins in particular, we can hash the images to see like all other occurrences of the same image on Pinterest. Look at the descriptions of all of those pins. Look at the boards that they're on. Look at co-occurrence of other pins on those boards. We can look at boards data, so we can start to infer things about the pins on a board, like kind of like looping together that information. We can look at some of the other features, like the domains that they're coming from.
Okay.
Right, so there's like, if it's coming from like Art Daily, that's probably architecture. So there's a lot of other signals we could start looping in, and then we were starting to use more of the machine learning to just like build these classifiers to see like what is this board likely to be, what is this pin likely to be, so we could make sure that the content was thematically correct.
Yeah.
But it is a little bit tricky. Like there are some things where the definitions of those categories are a little bit like taste driven. So what belongs in art? Like,
yeah, it's hard to play semantics with code.
Yeah, so it's like, well, what is considered art? Like, somebody's sketch that's on DeviantArt count as art, or is this like museum quality art? What does history mean? Like some people are putting things like from their childhood and they put it under history. It's like, well, this is a different definition of history, right? So there's some things that we needed to define, like what do we believe this category means? So we have kind of like a target set that we're training against. So there's some manual work to define like what we thought each of these categories meant, so we can start building classifiers toward those targets.
Yeah, and now as you increase the feed quality, did you see the growth increase? Did you see kind of a tangible impact with engagement and things like that? Or did it really not show a correlation there? What did you guys see?
Yeah, we actually have seen in that, and also like more recent feeds improvement projects, the quality and flow, so like how fresh are all the pins and like how fast are things moving through, of the feeds actually does correlate with engagement, so the number of repins that we're seeing and like how many people are active on the service. Yeah. So it is really important that we get those right, because these are the main points. They're not the main points, they're like an important point of discovery. And we're talking about our mission being to help people discover things that they love. The discovery points are pretty important. So if we're doing a good job with the feeds and showing people things, it does improve engagement.
Yeah, well, it's like you mentioned earlier, Ben Silberman, he says, that you guys put pinners first. And this is kind of an example of that. You put pinners first because what are they doing? They're pinning. They're trying to find things they love, like you said. Yeah. So if you make that experience great, it's going to help everything in the company, right?
Yeah.
Sure. And I think that's just a good way, something for people to take away that are watching this is there's a core competency in every company. Make that core competency better and better and better and better, because whatever you do around the edges won't matter if you lose that. It doesn't matter how great the steakhouse looks on the inside if the steak isn't good, right? Yeah.
For sure.
And let me ask you this. What other projects have you worked on at Pinterest that maybe had anything to do with the user base and growth and retention, engagement? Have you done anything else that touches on things in terms of the growing company?
Yeah, one project I worked on a while back was emails. So both kind of the standard notifications type of emails as well as a weekly email. So those are super important for reaching out to people. Like this is your like off-site channel to get people to come back. So notifications are pretty straightforward, but there are some things we could do there. So when we first had our emails, it was like very basic, like just black text on white background with like blue links type of emails, or like, oh, somebody repinned your pin. But as we started building those out to be like interesting HTML emails with like images in them, we could use that as an opportunity to suggest to other boards for them to look at. So it might just be in the example of like somebody repinned your pin, we show the board rep of the pin that it got, or the board that it got repinned to, and it's thematically related because it is a repin relationship. If you're interested in that sort of content, you might click through and look at that board and say, oh, like I actually really like this board that someone repinned my pin to. So it's almost like recommendations via notifications. And then there's also the other category of weekly emails, which are more recommended content. And so those were super key for just reminding people that there's like great content on Pinterest, and just like another like touch point. Say, like, hey, like we have some cool stuff, and we looked at the things that you've added to Pinterest, and like based on those, we have some recommendations to show you.
Yeah. How much would your all's traffic take a hit if you stopped sending out emails tomorrow? Would it just be a drastic decline?
They're pretty important.
Yeah. How do you guys deal with like deliverability and things like that? Do you do it all in-house? Because email is like a whole other engineering feat. Or do you guys rely on third-party services to get the emails delivered?
So we use SendGrid pretty heavily, but we also have a lot of in-house infrastructure to make sure that for the weekly emails, we have to generate all the emails, which is like pretty substantial work. Like hitting all the different databases to get the data that we need, like queuing up the emails correctly. So there's a lot of in-house infrastructure that needs to be built out, but we do rely on third-party services like SendGrid for things that we don't need necessarily to build in-house.
Yeah, and that's good to hear because if you guys built that in-house, I was going to be really jealous at your all's talent because I would just get into the absurdity place. Well, this has been great. I got a few kind of final questions because you have been responsible for and a part of the teams that have really put the pieces together for Pinterest. I mean, you've been building the building blocks of this company that's grown so fast. So I want your take on this. How much do you think growth is luck and how much is skill? Because obviously you have a very skilled team there doing what they do. But how do you shake it out there?
There's definitely some component that's going to be luck, but you can get really good at growth. Like you can build out better engineering practices, like better abstractions, like better experiments frameworks, so that you can run a lot of experiments simultaneously and learn from those and start building things quickly. So you can make growth a competency of your company as well. So, I mean, there's going to be that element of luck, but you can be very prepared for good luck and increase your chances of luck, which is, I think, what you need to do in order to get a lot of growth.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you this. What lesson have you learned about growth in the last couple of years at Pinterest that surprised you? Something that happened that was like, oh, that's how growth works, that you just kind of always remembered?
There's a lot of lessons. One interesting one is that growth is actually going to be a lot of little things chained together. And, this new feature launch might just bump up your metrics by 0.5%. The next one might bump it up by like another 0.5%. And when you chain a lot of these small things together, they can have a really big impact. So it's important to understand how everything contributes to your overall system. Another thing that I've kind of learned about is understanding user states. So starting to model out how people are engaging with your service, like if they're new users, if they're very active users, or if they're users who've gone stale. There's a whole bunch of different categorizations you can have, and if you model out how people are transitioning between these different states, you have a good idea of where you want to start putting in those incremental gains. So for example, if you have a lot of people signing up for your service, and then a lot of them just don't become active users, then what you need to do is focus on new user experience, once they've signed up, showing them how to be active. Or if your problem is more that people are not even signing up, then you need to focus on acquisition, so a landing page to sign up conversions, right? So there's a lot of places that you can get drop off, or you can focus your attention to maybe reactivate users. But you need to have a good mental model of how everything is working, before you can figure out where to put your engineering focus and your product focus.
Yeah, if you don't segment out your users, you don't know where the funnel's broken, you don't know where to focus. So that's great. So last question, again, this has been an awesome interview, but people watching this, they're building their startup, they're a small team, they're a middle-sized team, and they're trying to grow. What's the best advice you have for any startup that's trying to grow? No pressure.
I think just kind of going back to that last point, like understanding your growth model is really important. So being disciplined and like instrumenting, understanding what your metrics are, where the drop offs are, where you're getting growth, and understanding all these different sources will really help you to focus your attention. And it's really important to be able to focus on something when you're a very small startup with limited resources. You need to know the highest leverage things to work on. So you need to have a good model that you can fall back to understand, like, if I work on this, it's going to have this sort of gain, instead of just like focusing on small things that don't matter.
Yeah, focus on what matters. Tracy, again, thank you for coming on Growth Hacker TV.
Yeah, thank you.